All right, ladies and gentlemen, Civics, Chapter 4, Lesson 2. We're going to talk about settling the colonies, the culture that grew up there, a little of the economy that grew up in the colonies, and how government start in the original 13 colonies. Cool beans. All right, so yes, we already talked that a lot of different people were either here on this continent, Native Americans, or came here from Europe. For example, the green parts of this map, the French settled in Canada, in the Great Lakes region, and France wound up owning a huge chunk of North America down through the country along the Mississippi River. Not only France, the orange parts of those maps also going to be owned by another European country. This country, Spain, to include our state of Florida. There's going to be immigrants from other European countries too, all around Europe. We talked about Swedish settlements in Delaware and Dutch settlements in New York. We're also going to have a large group of people, the African slaves, who are going to be brought here in chains as a large part of this growing nation. But who we're going to focus on more than anyone else is going to be the English settlers, the English immigrants. Why? They're the ones that are going to start these 13 original colonies. Of course, hopefully you've heard about this history before. They're going to create these 13 colonies owned by the government of Great Britain and King George III. These colonies are going to settle there along the Atlantic coast of North America. And of course, these 13 colonies will eventually rebel against the government in Great Britain. They're going to say the king and parliament aren't protecting their rights, their natural rights. And they're finally going to get to the point where they can't tolerate that anymore. They're going to rebel against King George III. They're going to declare independence. We're going to break away from Great Britain and the king and the parliament. And when you do that, you got to form your own government. So the bulk of what we're going to learn this year, of course, in civics is that government that these framers and founders are going to create. So we're focusing on the English settlers here, the English immigrants to North America. Why did they come? And it's an important question to ask because they risked a potentially dangerous sea voyage across the Atlantic Ocean. And then once they got here, particularly the initial immigrants and settlers, there was functionally nothing here. They had to create their own societies, their own livelihoods, basically out of forests and wilderness, all right? So the first English colonies are going to be founded in the state, or then a colony of Virginia. Why are they going to come here? Well, as you see in this cartoon, they had two big colonies in Roanoke and in Jamestown. And those colonies were really founded for one big reason: economic opportunity. These English immigrants, these English settlers came to Virginia because they thought they were going to be able to make money. Not just for themselves, but for their families. They thought they were going to, initially at least, they thought they were going to find gold and all this other cool stuff. They didn't find gold, but they did eventually figure out, hey, this is all free land. They're going to steal it from the Native Americans. And it's good land for farming and agriculture. So these Virginia colonies are going to become these relatively wealthy, rich colonies that are based on agriculture. What are they going to farm? A lot of things, but that big Virginia cash crop we're going to hear about is going to be tobacco. It's a little bit different up north. People are going to settle in New England mostly because they're looking for religious freedom. You've heard of these people, whether you remember it or not. These are the Pilgrims or Puritans that settle in New England. Yes, the Thanksgiving stories and legend that you might have heard about in grade school. So the Puritans or Pilgrims, They were members of a religious community. They were experiencing a great deal of prejudice by the British government. So they wanted to find somewhere new, somewhere they could go where they could worship the way they chose. They wanted religious freedom. So they founded those colonies in New England, particularly that first one in Plymouth. Why? Because they were looking for religious freedom. So you're going to want to know that. You are going to see that again. Why did people come here? Okay, they came for a lot of reasons. What are the two big common reasons these English settlers came to the 13 colonies for? One, economic opportunity. They wanted to make money. They wanted to improve their lives for themselves and their families. And then the second big reason people came here, religious freedom. Think Pilgrims, Puritans in Massachusetts, Plymouth colony. All right. So when you're creating these big farms, you need people to work on your big farms. When you're creating these new societies, you're creating these new places, you have to have workers. And it wasn't always easy to attract or get enough workers to do what you wanted to do, particularly in those farms. So they invited people over with this strange little deal that sounds weird to us today, but was common in these early colonial times, called indentured servitude. How would it work? You would advertise back in England and say, hey, you want a new opportunity at life, you want a job, you want to put some food in your belly, you want a new place to start, to lead a life of your own so you could get married and you could have a family and you maybe have a business someday and you may have a farm someday. Well, a good place to start it is here in these American colonies. So indentured servitude worked this way. If I'm the farmer, I'm the employer back in the American colonies, I would pay for your ticket, because it was expensive. I would pay for your ticket to sail over from England to Virginia. Once the indentured servant got to Virginia, they agreed, I will work on your farm, or whatever the business may be, for 3 or 5 or 7 years. Once those 3 or 5 or 7 years, once the term of the contract is ended, that person now goes off. They have some money in their pocket. They have some skills. They know the land. They know people. They have friends. They have connections to the wider community. And now they have an opportunity. They're going to buy their farm. They're going to start their business, okay? So this idea of indentured servitude, it's a deal, a contract. The indentured servant would get a ticket to come to the colonies, and they basically pay this back by agreeing to work in that farm, for example, for a period of time. Great. I am poor, I'm penniless, I have no job. I'm in the streets of London. I see an advertisement. Come to Virginia, great opportunities, make money, start your life. Sounds like a good deal, but I am poor. How am I going to do it? I'll tell you, I agree to pay for your ticket over. You come here, you'll be on my farm, you'll live there, I'll feed you. Are you going to get the best food and the best accommodations? No, but you're going to get enough that's enough to live on. You work in my farm. After 5 years, you're free to go, and then you can start your life in the New World, in the colonies, right? Indentured servitude. You're going to see this on the quiz. You need to understand this. So why are they coming here? Are they coming here for religious freedom? No, they're coming here for economic opportunity. All right, so of course, everybody doesn't worship the same way. They don't agree on how religion works, how to worship, how to practice their faith. It's as old as people. So during this time period, we're talking early 1700s, we want to focus on religious dissenters. Dissenters are people who disagree with the rest of the people in that community. Okay? So in England, the majority, to include the government, was of one religion, the Church of England, the Anglican Church. Well, you had these other smaller religious sects or groups that didn't want to worship the same way everybody else did. They wanted to do it their own way. They had their own faith system. Well, it sounds weird to us today in America in 2021, where we can practice our faiths, our beliefs and our faith any way we want. That wasn't the case in England. These people, and we're talking here about Pilgrims, Puritans, faced religious prejudice and religious prosecution and persecution by the English government. Think about how terrible that is. The most important thing in your life is your ability to practice your faith freely, the ability to worship freely, and your government isn't letting you. You're going to want to change that situation, right? So these people did. They saw that they have a whole new opportunity in the new world, in the American colonies, and they took that opportunity. They sailed across that ocean. I think they were trying to get to Virginia, but they were way off course. They wind up in New England, Massachusetts, and they formed that first Massachusetts colony there. They call it Plymouth. All right, and yes, from this springs the Puritans with their black uniforms, with the tall hats with the buckles on them, and working with the Native Americans there to survive. And then that all goes into the Thanksgiving story that we still recognize today, right? It's part of Americana, part of our cultural heritage. Great. So these people leave Europe, and again, focusing mostly on England, because they wanted religious freedom. Now, was it just Pilgrims or Puritans? No, of course, you'll see here on the slide. It's a lot of different people. Quakers, Catholics, Jews, and Calvinists. The Pilgrims and Puritans are going to start out in Massachusetts, and then they're going to also found colonies in Rhode Island and Connecticut. The Quakers, famously, if you're a Pennsylvanian, they pretty much become the people who found the colony of Pennsylvania. Catholics pretty much found the colony of Maryland. And of course, other religious minorities like Jews and Calvinists and others find an opportunity to practice their religion and faith freely. And it's going to be these American colonies. It's important to understand that history back then, and it's also important to appreciate why do people immigrate to the United States today. Economic opportunity still important? Sure, it's a rough world out there, and America is one of those places where potentially you could live a better, safer life, make a life for yourself here in America, and enjoy these economic opportunities for you and your family. Well, same thing with religious freedom. There are big parts of the world you can't worship the way you choose. So if you got an opportunity to immigrate to the United States, are you going to do it? Of course. Makes sense. Let's change tack a little bit, and let's talk about what these colonies were like. All right, so we're going to break these 13 original colonies into 3 groups. New England, way up there to the north. Now I'm going to sneeze. The middle colonies, which cleverly enough are in the middle, and then the southern colonies, again, a giveaway by that name. They're going to be the southernmost colonies. Those are the colonies in the south. So let's talk about New England. Well, we're talking about the northern colonies here of Connecticut, Rhode Island, Massachusetts, New Hampshire, and what's eventually going to be Vermont and Maine. What was it like up there? First, a lot of the people came there for that religious freedom purpose, okay? What was their economy like? How did they make a living? Well, they found it wasn't the best place for farming. They had short growing seasons, basically short period of nice weather, and longer periods of bad weather, to include pretty severe winters with lots of snow and ice. So not the best place to farm. They also had rocky soil and not the best terrain to farm in. What did they have? they had wilderness and they had trees. So you would see that cutting down trees for lumber, sawmills, shipbuilding are all going to be important parts of the New England economy. They're going to have lots of ability to have not only ships, but ports. So when you have ships and you have ports to put the ships in, they become centers of trade. So you see New England is also going to be big for small and growing businesses and trades. And what do you mean trade? Well, people would go to these ports with their products, whatever they are. They put them on ships and then they sail it back to England, sell it, and that would be the economy, a big part of the economy there. They would trade these goods with other countries in Europe, particularly England, to make some money. So we're going to see that lumber, shipbuilding, trade, and these small and growing businesses are going to be big in New England. Cool? Cool. What else you have going on there? Well, when you have lots of ports and lots of shipbuilding, you could build ships, and what else do? They fish, and then they whale. Whaling? Yeah, you've probably heard of it. Back in the day, you used to hunt whales. Why? Not so much for the meat, but those whales are packed with oil, which they burn in what we'd use oil in today for lighting. They burn the oil in lamps, etc. Other whale parts are useful. You might have heard of baleen. That is the thing that the plankton-eating whales have in their mouths to strain all that stuff out there, and that baleen was useful for a lot of things. Today we'd make stuff out of fiberglass, or we'd make it out of plastics. They would use baleen where we would use a fiberglass or a plastic or something like that today, right? Cool. New England. Again, not the greatest place for farming because of bad soil or bad weather, but much more productive for lumber mills, timber, construction, sawmills, shipbuilding, fishing, whaling, trade, business, starting a small business, but starting to get to be bigger and bigger businesses. The middle colonies, cleverly situated in the middle. We are talking about these states of two big ones, New York and Pennsylvania, and then some smaller ones like New Jersey and Delaware. Now, the soil was better, the climate was milder, the growing seasons were longer, so you do see some very successful and large farms in this area back then. You would farm not just to feed yourself, but you would farm to make massive quantities of this crop to sell it to somebody else. This is an idea of a cash crop. So, you would farm and you would sell that crop to other people, to include putting it on ships and sailing it back to Europe to sell to Europeans. So this would be how big cities like New York and Philadelphia, two of the big important cities then and still today on the East Coast in the 13 colonies and the 50 states today, would make a lot of money. You'd also have ranching, and eventually, particularly in the mountains of New York and Pennsylvania, you'd find ores like irons and things like coal. So over time, those things would contribute to a mining sector of the economy. When you have oil and when you have coal and you have big cities, you start being able to have these big factories, and that's really going to fuel these cities and make them big areas of trade, business, and manufacturing in the middle states. Cool? For the quiz, you're going to see this idea of the weather was nicer in the middle states, so they could grow and they could farm much more successfully than New England, and it comes into this idea of cash crops. You are going to make extra crops which you would sell to other people. Now the southern colonies. We are talking everything south of the middle colonies. So we would talk about Maryland, Virginia, North, South Carolina, and Georgia. How about Florida? Not yet, remember. Florida's still owned by Spain in this early colonial period. So, the South becomes the big agricultural area. They have these large farms, and you're going to hear this term, plantations. So they're going to have these large farms, these large plantations, where they just grow acre, square mile of these cash crops. What crops are there going to be? There's a range of crops. Of course, Virginia is going to be very famous and get very rich off growing tobacco. Send that tobacco back to Europe, and yes, polluting the lungs of millions of people and generations of humans down the line. But there's also going to be things like rice and corn and other agricultural products. And eventually in the South, a big agricultural product, especially in the deep South, is going to be cotton. All right? Cool. Questions on that? Probably not. And if you ask, I can't hear you. But that does bring up a point. If you are stuck at home because you're quarantined, you're sick, or you're away from school because you're on vacation, or you've been kidnapped, or you're doing a tour with a musical group, if you have questions for me, just ask. How do you do that? Best place you could do it is you can email me, or you could chat to me on Teams, or you can join me at Remind, and you could just text it to me. Remind, how does that work? Just text 81010, the message at the Hobbs MI, and we can text back and forth. Great. So that's the southern colonies. Cool. Now, reality of life in the southern colonies, particularly on these farms that got larger and larger, plantations, you didn't have combines and tractors and harvesters back then, okay? If you had a farm, that's going to take a great amount of labor and effort to work that farm successfully. A big farm, big plantation is going to take a lot of labor to work it, all right? New England farm, really small. Maybe that farmer and the family can run that farm. These big plantation farms, it just was going to be no way. Flies back. So, at first, they try to attract these indentured servants. Remember these people? We pay for their ticket to sail over from England, and then they work for me on that farm for 3, 5, 7 years. Once those years are over, they could go off and start their own life in the Americas, right? Well, there weren't a lot of indentured servants, and there weren't a lot of people that just wanted to do that hard farm work on these huge plantations. So relatively quickly, we're talking as early as 1619, these southern farms and these big plantations are going to start relying upon human labor in the form of African slaves, to the point some of these states were almost half slave, okay? So this fact, when half your population are slaves, when a tremendous portion of your economy, your system of jobs and employment and money and culture all tied into this slavery business in reality, it's going to be a pretty important part of Southern life and affect the Southern colonies. And eventually all the colonies in the United States. Cool. Shifting gears again. Great. So you got 13 colonies from Massachusetts to Georgia. They're all kind of founded by different people for different reasons. They're all going to be different. All right? Don't think each of these colonies were similar. So when we're talking here about the governments in these colonies, we're going to talk about generalities because they weren't all exactly the same. So what are the generalities? What do we want to know about these 13 colonies and their governments? All right. They typically had some sort of legislature, a law-making body. House of Burgesses, that big first law-making body in Jamestown, Virginia. Sort of modeled on the idea of England with their legislature, their lawmaking body of Parliament. Then they would have some sort of governor, just like a state has today. the chief, the head of the executive branch, the person, if you want to pick one person, who runs the state, you got a governor. Well, we had governors back in these colonies too. Where did these governors come from? And that's one of those things that was different from colony to colony, and it changes over time. Some colonies elected their own governors, typically out of that legislature. Other colonies were run by a governor that was appointed and sent by the king. Okay? But if you want to look at that generality, the thing we want to start getting, and the important point is, these 13 colonies started to become very comfortable with running their own colony and governing themselves. These colonies weren't sitting here with the king and parliament constantly telling them what to do. Almost the opposite. For parts of the colony's history, Parliament and the king kind of left the colonies alone, and the colonies did their own thing. They governed and managed themselves with these legislatures, state legislatures, like House of Burgesses in Virginia, and sometimes their own governors. Even if it was a governor appointed by the king, that governor was affected by the legislature in the state, the population of the state, and the time distance for messages getting back and forth across the Atlantic. It's hard to think of these governors as being locked in so close with the king and parliament. They were kind of over here on the other side of the world, kind of doing their own thing. All right, great. Another thing in general common was these colonies and these colonists really took seriously that they were English men and women, and they were generally loyal to the crown and parliament. Okay. Yes, that's going to change over time, but in these earlier stages, if you were in the American colonies, you were an Englishman or woman, and you felt that way, and you felt loyal to that government and the parliament and the king over there, okay? So that was another general commonality and an idea of government there, all right? Questions? These ideas of government, though, are really going to get built in, and the thing that's going to change over time, we're going to see these colonists get used to their own governments, running themselves and managing themselves. And when the king and parliament start trying to change that and tell the colonies what to do, that's when the colonies start getting upset, and that's when they start questioning their loyalty to parliament and the king. You know, when you left me be to do my own thing, yeah, cool. I'm an Englishman. I dig the king. Parliament's great. But now when you're telling me what to do and you're restricting my freedoms, yeah, that's not going to be so great. And that's going to upset colonists. We want to keep remembering and thinking about Locke. I think we mentioned Locke before. We're going to mention Locke again, but here's another opportunity to talk about John Locke. Okay, so the colonists are Englishmen. They get their ideas of law and principles of government from English history, English law, how things are run in England. Okay? So a big thing the colonists knew about, and a big idea, was the ideas of John Locke. John Locke looks at the social contract between a citizen and the government and says, hey, citizen gives up some right to the government, and it's the government's duty to protect the rest of those rights, right? Hobbes had this idea of social contract too. Locke also says that people have these things called natural rights. It's not something that you get given to you by a government. It's something you have at birth. At the time, you can consider it as you were given these God-given rights. These are natural to you at birth. Locke's going to say this is the state of all humans, making all humans equal. Great. So John Locke, social contract between government and the citizen, natural rights, rights all human beings have at birth. Well, what are these natural rights going to be? We've probably heard these before because Locke's ideas get plagiarized or used, is probably a nicer word, by Thomas Jefferson when he's writing Declaration of Independence. Locke theorizes that the natural rights of humans are the right to life, the right to liberty, and the right to property. Life, liberty, and property. Starting to sound hazily familiar? So Locke's going to argue human beings, by their humanness, are gifted, born with equality, and born with these natural rights. A life, I am allowed to live my life, that you can't take my life away from me. Government should be protecting my right to life in this social contract. Liberty. Liberty is my freedom to live my way the way I choose. So Locke will argue that freedom is the natural state of man, and it's government's job to protect that freedom. And then property, I should be able to amass, enjoy the protections of the fruits of my labor, my property, whatever it is, money, my farm, my house, etc. All right? So Locke says this is something all people get: the right to life, the right to liberty, and the right to property. Great. And the last thing, and this is a big thing to remember as we see where the American colonists go, Locke says in the social contract, if the government isn't protecting my natural rights to life, liberty, and property, the contract's broken. A citizen who's not getting their rights protected by their government can end that contract. They don't have to just put up with it. This is the kind of stuff the colonists know and understand. So when the colonists start feeling like the Parliament and the English government under King George II isn't protecting their natural rights, they're going to say, "Ha, Locke! If you're not protecting my natural rights, you're not doing your job. You're breaking the contract. You're breaking the social compact. So I could rebel. I could declare independence. I could replace you with my own government, which will protect my natural rights." All right? Critical stuff. And yes, life, liberty, and property. When Jefferson's writing the Declaration of Independence, he's going to talk about this idea of natural rights too. And it's not really plagiarism, because everybody knew that Jefferson's just expanding and expounding and talking about the ideas of Locke. Jefferson's going to call them, of course, famously, the pursuit of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, right? Pursuit of happiness, yeah. Sound a little bit better than just plain property. It is a little more elegant. Is that everything there? Sure. Why will you see Locke in the EOC? And you will. If you understand Locke and his ideas on the social contract, citizen and the government. Government exists to protect the citizen's rights, natural rights, life, liberty, and property. Government exists to protect the citizen's right to life, liberty, and property. And then the improvement on the social contract, which means if government doesn't hold its side of the deal, the citizens get to break that deal, break the contract, and form a government that'll do the job properly, all right? Great. So our founding fathers, our framers of the Constitution, this is going to be some of the most important stuff that's going to be in their brains. And that's why it's critical for you, young citizen, to get this Locke stuff. Cool. We're going to do a lot with political cartoons. They are fun but challenging to teach, y'all. So you got a political cartoon there on your right. And hopefully you recognize we got King George III and leading colonists. And poor King George, he's taken quite the bloody nose. So, if you look at that political cartoon, and if you can't even read it, clearly this is going to be a political cartoon supporting some of these colonists who are disagreeing with the king, violently punching him in the nose, probably about what key issues? The fact that the king and the British government are not protecting their natural rights, and if your natural rights aren't protected, you get to break that contract and you get to form your own government. Cool. Quiz is going to ask you about how did the king and parliament see the colonies? King and parliament saw the colonies as their own little piggy bank, their little cash drawer. So the king and parliament started making decisions and started treating the colonies like this. And yes, the colonists are going to rightfully see this as violations of their natural rights. And these are the things that are going to provoke our colonists to the eventual rupture, the eventual rebellion, the war, and our declaring our independence and forming our own country. This is another huge part of this civics material. You definitely get 1, 2, 3 questions about this on the EOC. And we're not at the revolution yet. We're getting there. We're setting the stage for it. And understand how this stage is set for the eventual revolution is important. So you got to be able to say to yourself, colonists are from England. They're English citizens. They're loyal English citizens. But they're left alone here in the English colonies to create their own governments, sometimes even their own governors, which they're quite happy with. They read their luck. They get this idea that government is here to protect your natural rights. And if government doesn't protect your natural rights, you should do something about it. You should have a government that does these things. So as we see, as King George III and Parliament make some pretty terrible decisions on how to handle the colonies, that's going to spark into actual warfare and revolution and create our own little country. Well, big country, biggest and most powerful in the world, right? Cool beans. As always, keep up with the work best you can. Communicate with me, please, if you are quarantined or out. Ask questions. If you have trouble understanding, if you have trouble gaining access to things, if you have trouble submitting work, the best way to fix these things is through communication. Email me, text me on Remind, join me on Remind by texting 81010, the message at, that's the ampersand, at Hobbs MI, or go to Teams. You have Teams on ClassLink. It's as simple as opening up ClassLink, hit that Microsoft Teams icon, get in there and ask me something. Message me, ask me something on chat. And if none of this stuff is working for you, have somebody come to the front office, set up a meeting with me, call me, and we'll work this out, right? All right, great. Look forward to keep teaching you civics, and you keep learning civics.